Good morning. My name is Tyler McCann, and I am the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, and I am pleased to open this webinar. Please note that if you require simultaneous interpretation, you can click on the Wordly button on your screen and select the language of your choice. To remove Wordly from your screen, please select Ignore. Veuillez noter que si vous avez besoin de l'interprétation simultanée, vous pouviez cliquer sur le bouton Wordly sur votre écran et sélectionner la langue de votre choix. So let's get going. The Ag Policy Exchange webinar series offers a platform to dive into and explore diverse critical policy issues facing Canadian agriculture and food. These webinars and all of CAPI's work is made possible thanks to the support of partners who understand that agriculture and agri-food can do more and that policy plays a critical role in unlocking the sector's potential. Today's webinar was funded by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada under the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership Agri-Competitiveness Program. We are also pleased that this webinar is part of our ongoing partnership with RealAgriculture. Working together, we're excited to bring deeper dialogue and tough conversations to people working in and around the sector across multiple platforms. For more information and upcoming content, you can visit realagriculture.com or go to CAPI's website and subscribe to our mailing list. You can also visit the new Real Ag Policy Hub, where you'll find columns, past and upcoming webinars, and policy briefs and discussions. Make sure you sign up for the Real Ag Policy newsletter so you don't miss any of the content coming out of the CAPI Real Ag partnership. We're really pleased that today's webinar is also presented in partnership with BASF Agricultural Solutions. I'd like to welcome Ray Daniels, the North American Sustainability Manager for BASF, to say a few words.
Thank you, Tyler, and it's great to be here today with everybody, and we're proud to support the discussion on such an important and timely topic. At BASF, we believe innovation in agriculture and biofuels will play a critical role in building a more resilient, competitive, and sustainable future for Canada. Biofuels are not only a tool for reducing emissions, they're also strategic opportunities to strengthen agricultural markets, support energy security, and create new value streams for Canadian farmers. From where we sit, Canada has a real opportunity to lead. There is strong momentum across the value chain, from growers to crushers to fuel producers, but turning that potential into reality requires moving from ambition to execution. And one of the most important enablers of that is the policy environment. Creating a clear, durable, and practical framework to the clean fuel regulations is essential. Policy certainty, not perfection, but just certainty, is what drives investment decisions, builds domestic production capacity, and ensures Canadian producers remain competitive in the rapidly evolving North American market. At the same time, success in biofuels ultimately depends on farmers. Their participation will be driven by clear economic value, practical pathways to engage, and confidence that this market will be stable over the long term. As an industry, we need to make sure those signals are aligned. At BASF, we see our role as helping connect the value chain, bringing together innovation in agriculture, digital tools, and collaboration across industry and policy to enable this market to grow. We're committed to supporting solutions that work not just environmentally, but economically for farmers in the broader sector. That's why we're pleased to partner with CAPI and RealAgriculture for today's conversation, bringing together diverse perspectives to focus on practical solutions that can really move the sector forward. So we hope today's discussion helps advance ideas that strengthen Canada's biofuel sector, reinforce competitiveness, and continue driving both innovation and emissions reductions along agriculture and transportation. So thank you both to CAPI and RealAgriculture for bringing this conversation forward. I look forward, like everybody else, to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ray. And thank you for your support and the support for this webinar, but also for the real leadership I think that BASF has been showing. And we now, before we get into this discussion with this great panel that we've got with us today, we want to hear from you, the audience. And so we're going to put a poll up on the screen, give you a chance for you to share your thoughts with us. And really, we want to know, going into this conversation, which are the biofuels related issues that you think are going to be the most difficult for policymakers to manage? We'll see during the conversation how the results that you share, and as you answer this poll question, compares to what we hear from the panelists later on during the discussion. So hopefully that poll question will come up shortly. Here we are. And so the choices that we've given you today are industrial competitiveness, trade dynamics, fuel affordability, climate objectives, North American market integration. I expect that we will hear from all of those, from our panelists about all of these topics today. And as you're doing that, we'd like to take an opportunity to encourage you to register for CAPI's 2026 Exchange Conference that's taking place this October on the 6th and 7th in Ottawa. Our theme this year is Canadian Agri-Food in a Value-Added World. First and foremost, register before the 15th of June to take advantage of our launch pricing and save on the registration costs. But really, we all think that this discussion today on biofuels is a great example of this value-added world that we're in, and the need to better understand what are the pressures, what are the opportunities, what are the challenges that we face, and how can we do a better job taking the production that we have in Canada and adding more value to it. And so with that, let's take a look at the poll results and see what you had to tell us today. And so we've got kind of a split here. We've got a mix of people saying market integration, trade dynamics, industrial competitiveness, fuel affordability, and climate. And so clearly there is a set of issues that you think are going to be pressures today, and we will wait and see what our panelists have to say about that. And so over to you then, Sean, to help kick things off and get the in-depth discussion going.
Hey, appreciate it, Tyler. Great stuff. And you can definitely see the split there across those results. Indeed. What we're going to do is we're going to have a one-on-one conversation here with David Schick. He is with the Canadian Fuels Association and with the CFA, this version of the CFA. We have other CFAs in the industry, but for the Canadian Fuels Association, he is the VP for Western Canada in Innovation and Regulatory Affairs. Dave, it's great to have you on here.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Thanks for including me.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess off the top, who does the Canadian Fuels Association represent? Who are your members?
Our members are the folks that produce and distribute transportation fuels in Canada. So you have to have operations in Canada to be a member. So these are integrated oil companies, but also the renewable fuels suppliers. And increasingly, traditional oil and gas companies are producing their own renewable fuels within their operations. So those are the folks we represent. So 96% of the fuel that's distributed in Canada are our members.
And I guess would you consider the Canadian fuels industry to be, would you classify yourself as pro biofuel? And I guess answer that one first.
Yeah, well, I would actually. I think that it's pretty clear to us that if you're going to evolve the transportation fuel sector and you understand that there's going to be a need for liquid fuels, biofuels is going to be a big part of that. And it became apparent to me a number of years ago that if you want to maintain your refineries' competitiveness in a way the globe is moving towards lower carbon fuels, you need to integrate biofuels into that process, not just in blending, but also manufacturing them through our existing processes in order to sort of ensure we can maintain the utilization of those facilities and make sure that they're lower carbon for the future.
Was it always this way? Was the association and its members always pro biofuel?
No, we were the Canadian Petroleum Products Institute in 2012, and we
that sounds very anti-biofuel, Dave.
Yeah, no, it was. Well, when I started all of this, I used to go to the renewable fuels conferences and hear fire and brimstone stories about how the oil and gas industry was the most wicked thing in the world. And then those folks would step off the stage and ask me if I wanted to buy some ethanol. So I think it's a real, that was sort of a lead into where we got to. And what happened, I think, is that the previous Liberal government was focused on electrification. And so the folks that made liquid fuels and understood we were going to need them for a long time started to realize we had more in common than apart. And so we started to work more closely together with agriculture and with the biofuels standalone facilities, acknowledging that we were going to need, especially in Canada, given our expansive geography, we're going to need these liquid fuels, and we need to make sure we're evolving them. So that changed in the last 3 or 4 years.
Okay, so it is rather recent then. That is interesting. Now, currently, there's a lot of push from your members as well as the agricultural industry to make some changes to the clean fuel regulation. And you'll hear it throughout the webinar today referred to as the CFR amendments. What is the single most critical change that the CFA would like to see with those amendments?
Well, we'd like to see competitiveness in terms of the incentive structures with the US IRA 45Z. And what that means is that historically there's been a blender's tax credit in the States, and they moved to this thing that we talk about in our sector all the time, which is a production tax credit. And so the US has this significant incentive, a subsidization of their facilities. And when they sell the product into Canada, they get all the Canadian credits and stuff from the CFR. So this puts our producing people in Canada at a significant disadvantage. So the CFR amendments, as outlined, have a couple of things that we're looking for. The main one is a multiplier on the number of credits, which directly offsets, to avoid trade issues, directly offsets the 45Z to help us get to a level playing field. And that's the main thing that we're looking for.
Now, is that the case for both ethanol and renewable diesel, or are there differences between the two of those in those amendment changes?
The numbers can change. I think it's true for both. We're seeing some stuff on the ethanol side that's of concern, where there's tax credits for carbon sequestration, which lowers the carbon intensity of the fuel. That's the currency of how we measure these things. It's not just volumes of products. It's the lower carbon intensity has a bigger impact in how you can produce your credits. So there's a major pipeline for ethanol plants being put in to sequester the carbon, and that's going to lower their carbon intensity, which could really be a challenge to our ethanol producers in Canada. And on both bio-based diesel, we call it, which is renewable diesel and biodiesel, we're importing about 60% there and in ethanol from the US. And given all of the foundational pieces we have in Canada to do a good job of making these things here, that's a problem increasingly on energy supply reliability, on making sure we can do it, and maintaining our sovereignty, given we have that vulnerability. We're open, we want free trade, but we just want to make sure that Canada's producing in an optimal way to support our domestic market, as well as look towards exportation in the future.
Yeah, in order for the IRA to not be a threat, we need to find a way for the CFR and the IRA to be somewhat complementary to each other. Is that fair?
Yeah, complementary or sort of equitable, I think is what it boils down to. What we've seen is a tremendous amount of, like, we call it an incentive stack. So where you get benefit from certain policies and credit generation. For instance, in British Columbia, as a more rigorous program than the federal program, we had a flood of renewable diesel into that market over the last number of years. And in 2024, we were up to 31% renewable content in diesel. But very little of that was produced in Canada. And that's slowly changing, but it is a significant opportunity that's lost, and actually to the benefit of agriculture, which can be a highly supportive outlet for product and reduces geopolitical risk. I think that's one of the great things for agriculture. And over the next decade or two, also forestry residues can be turned into liquids that we can make fuel out of. And that process is commercializing now, but not at scale. The big deal is canola. We have a lot of it. And the energy industry uses a lot of product. And that's really one of the global sort of benefits in Canada is we have a lot of this product that could potentially be used for making these renewable fuels.
Yeah. Now, are there some administrative bottlenecks and delays regarding the carbon intensity approvals that are really kind of this currency, as you discussed, that are slowing down some of your refineries here in Canada?
Yeah, it's been a challenge, and I think that one of the things that we're dealing with is a regulatory structure that the CFR was put under, which is the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, has a lot of rigidity in it because it's a pollution pass go type regulation where you can't buy your way out. You have to be very, as one would expect. Well, now we have the CFR, which is a fundamentally a market-driven thing that has a bunch of different variables and a bunch of different ways you can comply. And yet the rigor necessitated by ECCC because of that structure makes it difficult to get the information. And also from foreign suppliers, you have to gather all that stuff, and then it needs to be third-party verified. We'd like to see that sped up significantly. It would be a big help to us. But the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, as obligated parties, which our members are, and to meet these targets, is a criminal statute. So that when we're conservative about things we ask for and try to get flexibility, it's partially because of that.
Now, you mentioned this earlier, the idea of liquid biofuels kind of being skipped, going from petroleum-based fuel all the way to electrification. I guess talk about the necessity for liquid biofuels here in terms of being more of a permanent place as opposed to just sort of this temporary bridge that people have been trying to skip.
For sure. I mean, we identified it pretty early on that we weren't going to be able to electrify everything. And I think that, it doesn't mean electrification isn't going to play a prominent role, but we have what we refer to as the hard to decarbonize sectors. And those we're going to need liquid fuels for a long time because they need to be highly intense or dense in terms of their BTUs, how much energy is there, and they have to be able to be moved around very easily. So this is aviation, rail, long haul transportation. Agriculture is another one because it's hard to imagine us being able to have electricity at the volumes that we need, where we need them all the time for our industrial sectors and for transportation, given the scale of the country. And that further has been sort of shown up because now we're looking at further requirements on the grid, like AI, all of the different things that we're looking for on making sure our homes are less energy intensive. And so for transportation fuels, I think that electrification can play an important role in light duty vehicles in urban areas. It can play an important role for return to base deliveries and buses and that kind of thing. But as we expand, given the scale of the country, there really isn't a practical technology to keep medium and heavy duty vehicles, planes and stuff moving around without liquids. And we can lower the carbon intensity to very low levels now. We see pathways forward. So the liquid fuels can be a really powerful way to have good carbon outcomes and not put unnecessary strain on the grid.
I'm curious, from your perspective at the Canadian Fuels Association, how can your group work more collaboratively with the biofuel sector and the agricultural industry? If you want to look at it as this three-legged stool, there's probably some legs there I'm missing, but are there opportunities to be a little bit more collaborative on this file?
Absolutely, there is. I think that, I think we lost the plot over the last few years a little bit. When we started talking about renewable fuels policies, as they started in the States, started with the farmers, and it was a way to make sure that they were supporting their market. And then there was a benefit of improvement to the environment. Our previous government extended that, made it more difficult and more dense around decarbonization was the only thing we were talking about, forgetting about affordability, reliability of supply, all the other critical things that we need. And so I think what we need to do between agriculture and the energy industry is to describe to those that are pushing back against the opportunities for biofuels from economic growth, for rural development, supporting and diversifying our markets. That story needs to be told along with decarbonization so that it becomes a bipartisan thing in Canada where the federal conservatives and the liberal mindset are understanding that this is good for the country. And I think that we can working with agriculture and energy together, two of the largest sectors in our economy, that's an opportunity set for us.
Yeah, and at a time where affordability is like the number one concern for Canadians, if you want to talk about ethanol for a second, there's an example where ethanol-based fuel lead us to more affordable fuel sources. Like I was in, and we hear this a lot more in the US. I was in Nebraska a couple of weeks ago, and you look at the pump prices, there's about, it felt like 10 options across the pump, Dave. That there's some infrastructure costs there for retailers, but there's a lot of different options. And when you look at the higher ethanol blends that are available, those are also the more affordable fuels for people that are putting fuel in their tank.
Absolutely. And the credits generated and the requirements in the system support that. Now this ebbs and flows though, right? So crude is through the roof, and the agricultural market hasn't affected that much. So the differential is profound right now, but I think it's the diversification of the energy mix so that we can have more reliability and not rely on one thing or another. As we saw in Europe, and we just talked to the folks in Australia, they used to have 8 refineries, now they have 2, and they're begging for product or desperately seeking product from Canada because they don't have that capacity. And so as we make sure that we're making these biofuels in Canada, along with our traditional oil and gas products, those two together will help support affordability, reliability of supply, and economic sovereignty. So yeah, I think that I think what's happened though is we have this list of things we need to do for energy, affordability, reliability, decarbonization, amongst others. And that list shifts over time as to what the public really cares about. But you need to have all of those dimensions in mind all the time to make sure that you're giving the best and most reliable service to the consumer.
Yeah, and obviously we have, wheat and rye and corn as it applies to ethanol production, and from a bio-based diesel perspective, renewable diesel, we have canola, and we've got 20 plus million acres of it, and a considerable investment that's being made when it comes to domestic crush. I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit more about that later on. Do you see agricultural feedstocks as a critical component of this? Because there's a lot of feedstock options, Dave. Like, you can go in a lot of different directions. So how important are agricultural feedstocks to meeting some of these requirement levels?
Well, canola, for example, is one of the best things you can use to blend into a refinery. And the amount of product that we use in that capacity is quite extraordinary. So I think something else is people lose sometimes is the scale of the energy industry. So, for example, the new Strathcona Imperial Oil facility outside of Edmonton, and they built a $700 million facility to produce renewable diesel. It uses about 2.5 million tons of canola a year. To make 1 billion liters. So we, as an industry, we're not going to do this. But if we said, well, we're going to make everything out of canola, all of our fuels, we need over 200 million tons of product in order to do that. That's obviously not the case. But what it shows is that these things need to be complementary to one another in order to make sure that we're supporting the agricultural sector and allowing the energy sector to evolve to these lower carbon fuels. And the carbon intensity of renewable diesel made in Canada is about 20 versus about 90 for diesel produced from traditional methods. So although the quantities are relatively small against the aggregate, the environmental impact is very significant.
From a CFR amendment standpoint, you mentioned the multiplier. For some of the people that are watching this webinar, we're talking some inside lingo here, some inside baseball, so to speak. What exactly is this multiplier request?
Well, so when you produce fuels in Canada, then you generate credits. And if you get a multiplier, you get more credits. It doesn't count against your GHG reductions, but you get more credit into the market because we see a shortage in the market as the CFR evolves, not this year, but in the coming years. So we need the more credits allow for greater liquidity in the market so that everybody can comply and the system is more stable. And I think that in conjunction with competing with the US is what we're looking for. The other problem is if you don't have enough product and credits in the market, the price of the credits to buy them, of which there is some option of that, gets so expensive that the affordability issues come into play. And that's not in anybody's interest. So, we heard last week at a conference, there's about $6 billion worth of credits in the market, and that'll continue to grow as stringency increases. So it's not a small amount of exposure that people have on their balance sheets with these credits in order to comply. And so we want to make sure we're keeping it going, but also have a system that is efficient and allows us to innovate and looks more broadly than just meeting our domestic requirements over time.
Yeah, it's like this weird mix of we really do need a North American market. Because, but at the same time, we need this North American market and the opportunity that obviously the U.S. economy provides, especially when we look at bio-based diesel and exports of canola oil. But we also can't meet all of our requirements on the ethanol side by producing only domestically. Like it's this weird mix of like we need a North American market, but we also need to ensure we do have a domestic market as well. And that's maybe that's what complicates the policy creation here.
Sure. And I think, the thing we have to watch too is what's going on in the States. So their new renewable fuel obligations in the States may mean that we're going to end up not having enough renewable diesel to meet our domestic requirements for importation as well. So the trade dynamics are going all kinds of different directions. And a lot of it from a Canadian perspective supports having an open market where we're trading, but enough domestic production to ensure that we're taking advantage of the opportunities for Canada.
Yeah, well put. We've been talking to Dave Schick. He is the VP for Western Canada for Innovation and Regulatory Affairs with the Canadian Fuels Association. Dave, it's been great to chat with you today.
Thanks very much, Sean. Appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome stuff. Hey, Tyler, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sean. And thank you to Dave for setting that off. Again, I think you touched on many of those choices that we put up at the beginning of the poll. And now we will dive deeper with some of our panelists today. I'd like to first bring in Bruce Burrows. Bruce is the new Executive Director at Grain Growers of Canada. Based here in Ottawa, he brings 4 decades of senior experience in government relations and policy leadership across transportation, energy, and infrastructure, including roles with the Chamber of Marine Commerce, the Railways Association of Canada, and Canadian Pacific Railway. Bruce, we're going to get back into some of that history of you later, because I think that there's some lessons that we can learn. But let's start with kind of where you sit today. How do you see the state of the biofuels industry, and what does it mean for grain growers in Canada? And what are your goals for the CFR?
Thanks, Tyler, and appreciate you letting the new kid in the block go first here. And so, given that I'm just weeks into the job, I should probably say right off the top, I'll read that small print at the bottom of the page as a disclaimer that says, nothing I say can or should be held against me. But seriously, I haven't mastered some of the intricacies of Canada's the CFR system yet, and all the nuances around biofuels, and I'll certainly defer to the great experts we have around the table today who are more knowledgeable than I. But I'll certainly want to say a few things here on behalf of my 100,000 grain farmers across the country who generally see the biofuels sector in Canada as a lucrative and growing market. I want to frame my comments in the context of risk. I think that's important. I've just come off, literally on Friday, I just came off a good long day visit with one of my farmer members in Western Quebec on the shores of the Ottawa River. And I quickly came to the realization that, farming is not hugely lucrative, really to make a go of things. And it's not unusual. He, for example, has to engage in all sorts of extra activities, whether it's tapping his maple trees for syrup or growing winter rye or providing custom services to other farmers in the neighborhood to make a fair living. Yet despite, providing or operating pretty thin margins, he's an extraordinary risk taker. And that's seen right across the country. We, Tyler, are right in the middle, as you know, of seeding season. Collectively, across the country, farmers are investing over $20 billion in inputs, feed, fertilizer, fuel, you name it. This is probably Canada's largest, single most consequential private investment. It's a national project over a 6-week period. So this puts enormous personal and financial capital at risk for this farmer I visited and for any other farmer, quite frankly, without knowing what's in store in terms of how that crop will grow. The markets are so unpredictable, so no really good insight in terms of how that product will get to market. So it's stunning to me that, quite frankly, they're willing to take this risk. So are farmers interested in new projects that can help mitigate that risk and bring a little more certainty to their domestic market? You bet they are, no question. But there are some buts, and maybe I can just review some of those. Let me make a few points. Competitiveness, I think, is a key. You speak about goals. I think that's a key factor for Canadian farmers here. Their competitiveness has been slipping. I think from a global perspective, input costs are up. Market signals are obviously in flux. And so there's, on top of that, some policy uncertainty. CFR is a little bit of policy uncertainty. So I would say point one, farmers see some policy gaps. And we've always, Dave has gone through this a little bit. There's a lack of policy parity, I think, clearly seen with the U.S. So to some extent, we're falling behind our U.S. competitors as they invest. The 45Z subsidy is, replaces the old flat rate tax credit system with this new performance system. And, that really, I've seen figures, brings an additional difference of 30 cents a liter between the two jurisdictions. So, fuel is producing lower emissions, but it's getting, a higher subsidy. As it were, period. And when it comes to, secondly, any input costs and tariffs affecting farmers, and again, I'm making a bit of a general point here. Tariffs, a classic example. We've seen that with Russian fertilizer. We're having to pay, particularly Eastern farmers, up to 35% on nitrogen. So, these things are adding more cost to the system, and this is reducing their returns. And so, in a similar way, we look at CFR, and it's a regulated mandate and an emissions credit system versus an all-out massive production-based tax benefit system, if I can put it that way, south of the border. And, that's resulting in, as I say, lower cost fuel in the US. And so that is a disparity that would have to be addressed. I would thirdly make a point that another factor which is hitting farmers too is what CFR amendments, as I understand, are could be potentially delayed. We were just chatting about this before the call began. It's going to go through to 2027, but there's still a couple of unknowns. And so, again, this is a little bit of uncertainty, which farmers are never happy about. And that potentially will affect incomes at a time when, they've got to make some key planning and financial decision making on the farm right now. Whatever regulatory frameworks are being discussed, they must first and foremost work, I guess I would say, for Canada's farmers. Same principle always applies when we look at transportation economic policy or pest management or trade rules. They all first and foremost have to work for farmers. And we don't want to create unnecessary barriers here. And so CFR, I think, has to be, Tyler, looked at in the same way. So we'd have goals of ensuring fair competition, strengthening domestic production, and supporting investment in Canada. So let me conclude. I would say that we certainly welcome growth in demand for our crops, be it canola and soya for biodiesel or corn for ethanol. But sentiment amongst farmers does remain complex, maybe is one way to put it. There's certainly financial optimism out there as commodity markets evolve beyond just traditional supply-demand factors for crops. 1 in 3 acres now of Canadian-grown canola is now diverted into the biodiesel pool, so to speak. Corn is also directly feeding now the energy market. A third of production is going into ethanol, which is clearly a proven now low-carbon fuel. And so these are all good things, and it's helping local processing in communities around the farms. That's something the farmers like. When we hear, and we'll get more specificity perhaps from Chris or Brittany, but we hear that the exploding domestic canola crush out west through private investment is certainly bringing an improvement to farm gate prices. And so that's positive. But I think biodiesel and ethanol both do support farm income. They support rural communities. They support domestic production. This is all a good thing. And finally, I would say that there's a little bit of maybe 2 quick points. There is sort of policy envy, I think, around what's going on south of the border. And that's something that we're constantly watching. And I would say finally, as an observation, and maybe this is more of a philosophical point, but I think there is some apathy or maybe it's indifference amongst farmers towards the way products are treated. Their products are treated at the federal level in Canada. This might be changing with the new federal Carney-led government, but my point is that on the one hand, the federal government for the last 10 years anyway has certainly seen our crops as traditional food commodities and has treated them, their emissions as climate threats. Yet on the other hand, under CFR, we're celebrating these exact same crops when they're turned into fuel. And so I would just conclude that it's not food or fuel, it's both here. Corn is a great example where corn, the starch is fermented into fuel, and the remaining fiber then is concentrated into dry distillers, grain for animal feed, and that's a local high protein food, which is all good. So this is a win-win scenario, not a one versus the other. So those are
great
comments off the top of my head, Tyler.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Thank you for kicking the panel discussion off. We'll now go to our second panelist. We'll bring in Brittany Wood. Brittany is the Senior Manager of Transportation and Trade Policy at the Canadian Canola Growers Association. Brittany works to advocate for farmers' interests in canola trade, biofuels, transportation policy, and innovation, building on her prior experience doing market development and promotion work around canola oil and meal. Brittany, we've already talked a lot about canola farmers, but let's drill down. From where you sit, how do you describe the state of biofuels or renewable diesel industry in Canada today? What does it mean for canola farmers, and what are you looking for out of the Canadian clean fuel regulations?
Great. Thanks, Tyler. Thanks very much for having me. That's a big question. There's a lot to it. I'll try and be succinct with how I go through this. But I would say, really looking at this through that canola farmer lens, from where I stand, my viewpoint, I think we're really hopeful about how the industry looks right now and the opportunities for growth, for investment, for future. So, the CFR is still, I don't want to say new, it's certainly not new, but it's still young. And definitely, I think that we're still in that beginning phases where we're seeing investments that are actually really coming to fruition, right? We have facilities that were announced and have been built. Strathcona facility already mentioned as a really important renewable diesel facility in Canada that's important to canola farmers. I know Chris will speak about crush, but that crush expansion in Canada is so pivotal to how canola is positioned in terms of market development, market opportunities, value added investment in our industry here in Canada. And I think one of the important pieces also as we look to kind of a few years out is just that we have a government that's engaging with industry. In September, back in September, the Prime Minister announced that there would be these targeted amendments. And really that engagement is happening where industry and those of us on the call have been able to engage with ECCC and really share what the CFR means to our industries, what it means to canola farmers, and the opportunities that we see. So I think, there's a lot of potential for our biofuel industry in Canada. Of course, there are challenges. Making sure that we have domestic biofuel production is very important to us. And I think what we're looking for is that long-term demand signal, right? We want to see long-term demand signal for domestic biofuel production that then really translates or drives back to canola market demand here in Canada. Just before I move on to maybe what are our goals for the CFR, I would say that, it's really important to just reemphasize, and I'm sure if you've heard, I'm sure we've talked about market diversification for canola, but it really is a very important part of the canola story is that biofuel markets and domestic biofuel production here in Canada is a real cornerstone to market diversification for canola. And so this is something the industry has, in fact, been working on for quite a number of years. We have just really had significant challenges with market access into China in 2025, started in 2024. We're in certainly a better position there. But, when we have market disruptions, we've got, China, our number 2 market, the United States, our number 1 market. We are always, as an industry, thinking about market diversification and working towards that. And so we think not just about new countries to sell canola to, but new uses or expanding uses. And so canola oil in biofuel production, that's a kind of a new use, but expanding our domestic canola oil consumption. And so I will say that since the beginning of the CFR, we actually have added about 500,000 tons of canola oil consumption here in Canada. That's really significant. I do follow kind of our markets where we're selling seed oil meal. 500,000 tons of market growth is something that we don't just see every day. Like that is a really good news story for us. So I think we'll kind of evolve this conversation, I'm sure, as the panel goes on, but maybe one thing I will touch on around the CFR and what we're looking for is really making sure that the CFR has a very strong connection with agriculture and that farmers, feedstock providers are really considered that first step in that low carbon fuel supply chain, or as Sean said, one of the legs of the stool, right? And so we are proposing measures around feedstock provisions and ensuring that North American feedstocks like canola oil are really strongly considered within the targeted amendments that are put forward.
Great. A couple of points to Brittany that we will pick up in the group discussion. Again, I'll save my follow-up questions for then. So thank you very much for kicking things off. We'll go to our next panelist, and that is Andrea Kent. Andrea is the Vice President of Government and Industry Affairs at Greenfield Global, and she's past President and Board Director for Renewable Industries Canada. Andrea is a leading Canadian voice in the renewable fuels and clean energy sector in North America, and she's co-founder of the Farms and Fuel Alliance. Andrea, you are in the ethanol space in your day job. From where you sit, how do you describe the state of the biofuels industry in Canada? What do you think it means for Canadian agriculture, and what are you looking for out of the CFR?
Yeah, for sure. I'm afraid I'm going to give you a little bit of a tale of two cities here, right? And certainly kind of looking at the reality right now facing a Canadian ethanol producer and a Canadian corn farmer. Again, I think Bruce called out 1 in 3 bushels in Ontario and in Quebec goes to the local ethanol plant. Same in the US. But maybe just really quickly, because I have had the privilege of working on this policy for 2016. So it is kind of refreshing when someone describes it as being a little bit new or nascent, because we have been at this for a long time. And it's not that the CFR is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's absolutely critical in underpinning Canadian demand for local biofuels production and all of the grain and demand from the local farms that come with it. You really can't have one without the other. Provinces are also very, very important. It's kind of a belts and suspenders. But when we talk about the CFR, a lot of it is like we're talking about it like it's very, very complicated. It's somehow technically very, very niche. It's optional sometimes politically here, right? Like we had this bipartisan, unwavering support for a national biofuels program of one shape or another, for over a decade on both sides of the border, starting with Stephen Harper, starting with, George W. Bush Jr. there. And, that's kind of changed in Canada. It hasn't changed in the US. Right. So I think first and foremost, if you want to close the gap and kind of what's at stake, an entire industry right now from an ethanol perspective is already at stake. There's a lot of on the horizon, a lot of diversification, a lot of really, really important market expansion talk on the canola side. But let's be really, really clear. What we're seeing in the ethanol side is that the threat has already arrived. It's already showing up in the marketplace. And it kind of is a harbinger of what happens when you kind of take your eye off of the prize here. So is the CFR complicated? On a fundamental basis, it's really, really simple. And I'll try to kind of go over it rapid fire a little bit, which again, forgive me, it's been a long decade. But having a national biofuels policy like the clean fuel regulation is not optional. It's absolutely essential if you want to make your own biofuels in any country, Europe, Canada, US. We grow corn, we grow grain, we have manufacturing heft, we need a national biofuels policy. Right now, it's just as Dave said, our national Canadian policy awards imports. Now we have subsidized imports, but rewards imports and domestic producers alike. So if you're an import, you're getting a subsidized import, you're getting a double dip, right? That was fine in 2016. 2026, that's becoming a really, really critical problem. So when you look at CFR amendments for ethanol, they're needed just so that a producer can have a fair shot at home. It's not about limiting trade. It's not about thickening the border. The US 45Z production tax credit, you're looking at, for ethanol that comes to Canada, it's a sophisticated low carbon fuel. That's exactly the fuel that the CFR attracts by design, right? So it's upwards of 30 cents a liter that they're carrying into our market. It's an exportable credit that they bring in compared to like a 7 to 10 cent margin. So there's no commercial gap for this. You need a policy fix. When you're talking about a multiplier, everything that Dave said about the multiplier is true, but it addresses that price weakness. The other thing that's important to understand is, ethanol demand is growing because it's affordable. It's a wholesale discount to gasoline, and it's perfectly clean burning essentially, and it works in every vehicle, by power on the road, right? So you see ethanol demand growing. That growing market share is being captured by imports. And that's not that Canadian production cannot grow. It's just that we don't have a policy to help it along. So we currently have $1 billion in shovel-ready projects in Ontario and Quebec that are waiting for these amendments. So when you look at where there's urgency, it's definitely more around the ethanol side on these amendments. When you look at where there's consensus, Dave and I both agree in a multiplier, right? So you see industry working hand in hand on it. But as other people have said, right, specificity on ethanol, the threat is already here. Solutions exist that are affordable. So delaying them is the real issue that ethanol is up against in the policy. It's not the nuance, it's not the details. We know it needs to get done. It's just doing it before 2027 where we can.
Appreciate you starting off again. Lots of things I want to pick up on. I will just say maybe again, if you can, because you touched on this, and I think that sometimes we lose sight of this, but you talked about kind of a tale of two cities. You referenced kind of the threat earlier. What do you see the potential impact of that threat? If that kind of threat follows through and you see the impact, what happens at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think we'll continue to see. Right now, we're seeing stalled investment because we can't make an economic case for expanding a facility that's already profitable, that's already been, running for years and years and years. But no investment committee, no bank is pulling the trigger right now until there's a Canadian equalizer of some sort for ethanol in our national policy, right? And this is why you kind of see some provincial domestic content regulations popping up because they're trying to kind of unstick and preserve that investment on the ethanol side. So that's kind of like the first wave. The second wave is that we don't see new plants getting built. We're seeing expansion projects in the US. We're seeing new ethanol plants in the US get announced, right? We're not going to see them announced in Canada. And then unfortunately, like the third wave is where you see it goes from kind of an opportunity cost to an actual cost, right? Where operations just start to wind down. That happened in the UK as well too, right? They went through a very similar instance where there wasn't a trade response to US 45Z. All their domestic ethanol production has since closed as a result, and now they're trying to kind of, come up with a more expensive taxpayer program to kind of get the lights back on.
Great. I appreciate that clarification. We will bring you back in a minute, but first we will start with our fourth panelist, Christopher Vate. Chris is a former executive director of the Canadian Oilseed Processors Association, but is currently a senior associate at Bjornson and Associates, an Ottawa public affairs firm focused on agriculture and food issues, and he spent 25 years in policy, regulation, government relations. Chris, Andrew just talked about kind of those threats, the potential, the impact on ethanol from an investment perspective. You've spent a lot of time talking to and working for oilseed processors. How do you describe the state of the renewable diesel industry? What does it mean for oilseed processors, and what do you think that we should be getting out of the clean fuel regulations in the future?
Yeah, thanks for the question and the opportunity to participate today. Yeah, I'm one of the lucky few who have been along for the ride in terms of the development of the clean fuel regulation over the last decade. So I appreciate some of the comments made by Andrea. I would actually maybe steal a line from Andrea in terms of the state of the biofuel industry in this country. It is a tale of two cities. I mean, if you look at the state of the market, I would say it's better than it's ever been. But at the same time, the state of the Canadian industry is quite precarious and fraught with a lot of challenges that many of the other panelists have outlined already. But just to maybe put a finer point on what I mean when I say the market is better than it's ever been, certainly from the perspective of canola and biomass-based diesel, demand has never been higher. So, for example, and folks that know me know that I like numbers because numbers help tell the story. So here's a number. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a doubling of biodiesel and renewable diesel demand in this country, and that's largely because of the clean fuel regulation. So we're now talking about 2 billion liters of biodiesel and renewable diesel demand. And to put that into perspective, that's approximately 7-8% of all diesel consumed in this country. So Dave said it quite rightly in his opening remarks. There's many different boxes that biofuels checks, but one of them increasingly is energy security. So 8%, that's really starting to move the needle from my perspective. And this has translated into real demand growth for canola and other feedstock as well. So again, by way of example, canola's utilization in the Canadian biofuel market is estimated to exceed 1 million tons of seed equivalent. I think Britt put in a nice number as well with regards to how much canola oil has been consumed domestically in the biofuel market at almost 500 million tons, or sorry, 500,000 tons. This has supported crush expansion. And to put the crush expansion into perspective as well, by the end of this year, we will see capacity for canola crush reach 15 million tons. That's approximately 75% of all the canola that is grown by Canadian farmers. So quite significant growth in crush expansion over the last number of years, and almost exclusively because of biofuels. Yes, there's many other uses for canola, but that growth in value-added crush is largely driven by biofuels. Maybe just one last number to put a finer point on the expansion of crush as well. Yorkton is a city in Saskatchewan where we have two major crushers located. Approximately 4.5 million tons of crush capacity just in that one region of Saskatchewan. 4.5 million tons. Just let that settle in for a second. That's approximately the amount of seed that we would sell to China on any given year. So when we talk about market diversification and managing risk, this is what it means. Just one region of the country is now able to take approximately 400 million tons of canola seed. So in my books, this is success and something that should be celebrated. Maybe pivoting quickly to the glass half empty perspective and some of those challenges. I don't want to reiterate everything that my colleagues have said. Clearly, there are challenges that need to be addressed to help support biofuel producers in Canada. That's absolutely essential. Yes, the demand signal is there, but it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't see supply keep pace with that demand. So we want to see more biofuel in this country. We also want to see more Canadian feedstock used in biofuel production in Canada. So to the earlier point that Brittany made, we do believe that there's a need to fix the CFR such that we see some prioritization of Canadian, US, and Mexican feedstock, taking a page out of the playbook from our US friends and applying a North American ring fence, if you will, to some of these different changes that are coming down the pike for biofuel producers. Also a big challenge, and again, this has been mentioned by others, but it's really how highly susceptible biofuels writ large, but maybe the CFR specifically is to the stroke of pen risk. And what I mean by that is change of government in terms of change of policy and removing the demand signal that we've all come to rely on. Maybe just in closing, I want to mention something that is more beyond these CFR amendments, but looking out to the horizon. Let's say, for example, that we do see the CFR manage to have some legs and last in the next 2 or 3 years. I think we need to start talking about what does the CFR or federal biofuel policy look like past 2030, past these targeted amendments. And again, making it nonpartisan is a no-brainer. So really emphasizing the importance of this demand signal past 2030, regardless of political stripe and who is at the reins of government. The second is enhance the ambition. So good start, the CFR. It's doing a lot of the things that it was advertised to do, right? Driving demand. But I think there's an opportunity to set some targets post 2030, really create that demand signal and that signal for investment so that we see more biofuel produced and we see the canola value chain, for example, also keep pace with what's coming down the pike over the next 10 years or so. And lastly, keep it simple. And I know that's easier said than done. I think the regulation, for anyone who's had the pleasure of reading it, is 200 to 300 pages long. It's full of nuance. It's full of technical mumbo jumbo. But there are opportunities when the time comes to take a look at some of that mumbo jumbo, if you will, and keep it simple, right? Keep it simple for farmers, but also keep it simple for others in the value chain.
Great. Appreciate that, Chris. Before we bring the other panelists in, a couple of questions, or maybe first a comment. I think we'll have to come back to Yorkton as a city on another time, and whether or not that's the right word to use. But you talked about kind of doubling of demand for renewable diesel, bio-based diesel. Um, what's production done over that same period of time as demand has doubled? Has production doubled too?
Oh, would that be nice if we saw production double? We have seen a record crop last year, so I think that speaks to the ability of Canadian farmers to grow more on the same amount of land. So there's optimism that we can continue to grow incrementally, doubling from one year to the next. I think anybody who is in agriculture can appreciate that's impossible. But I have a lot of optimism about the potential to continue to grow the production of canola in this country and grow the production of canola south of the border as well. There are some very interesting initiatives that are being undertaken by people in the value chain to enhance yields, but also increase the acreage, find acres on both sides of the border where canola can be planted.
But is Canada filling the doubling? Again, I think that just trying to kind of understand again the difference between where we're at in the ethanol market, right, where we see these challenges and versus how it's different in the canola space. Are we filling that extra demand with domestic production, or do we have production limitations that are standing in the way?
So if you're talking about the ability to feed more biomass-based diesel producers, the answer to that question is absolutely yes. So the crush expansion that has occurred over the last number of years is more than enough to help facilitate expansion of more biomass-based diesel production in this country. And sometimes people forget, I mean, 15 million metric tons of capacity, an impressive number, right? By the end of this year, 75% of all canola grown in this country crushed in Canada. Great news story. There's room for more. There's 5 million tons up for grabs, is the way that I look at it. So there's definitely opportunity for further crush investments as well.
Great. Appreciate that. So let's bring the other panelists in, and I'll take this as an opportunity to remind those that are watching the webinar to use the Q&A function, the chat. And I'm actually going to go to the chat for the first discussion to the group, because I think it is a question that is worth coming back to. And the question is, why are biofuels being pushed? Again, the context of the way the question is that they do use this finite resource, in the question it's phosphorus, but over the years it's been about agricultural land, it's been about kind of this impact on the food market. And so why are we doing this, and why should we be focusing on these markets going forward? Chris, why don't I start with you, and then we'll go around the table to gather others' perspectives on that.
Yeah, I think to some of the comments that have been made already, I think the reason that we're doing this is because it checks so many of the boxes. It does address what I think is a global issue as it relates to climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation fuels. It does incentivize investments in new technology. It does create market diversification opportunities for farmers, for crushers, for others in the value chain. So I think those are really the simple answers to the question in terms of why do we do it.
Andrea, from where do you said, how do you answer that question?
Yeah, oh, did they not unmute me? Can you hear
Yep.
me? Yeah,
Yeah, we can.
rookie mistake here, first day. Yeah, I think, like Chris said, right? I think the quickest answer to it is that because we don't want to stop growing and making things in Canada that we can grow and make in Canada. And everything that works for the US, which is in a mini ethanol boom right now and a global super producer of ethanol, works for the Canadian grower and producer here as well too. It really is a farm to energy connection. It's a beautiful and reliable domestic market when you're not dealing with structural policy issues like we're dealing with right now. And also, I think, just in terms of, kind of coming up the middle on some of the political divide as quickly as possible. It's just remembering that there used to be all of these splits in the market that we don't have anymore, right? The urban market needs fuel and gasoline that is provided by the rural market. Right. So I think that's it too. When you look at domestic economies, it really is a win-win across that split between rural and urban, between, farmer and manufacturing. So it would really be a shame to kind of take the eye off of it right now would be my answer to that.
And Brittany, what does that look like from your, I guess, perspective? Because I think one of the challenges that we've had talking to farmers about and getting farmers to engage on it is, as much today as we've said it checks all of the boxes, we spent the last decade talking about how this is a sustainability measure, and that's what's driving it. But when you're explaining to farmers why we need this, how are you justifying that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just comes back to demand for product. It's demand for canola. And so farmers want to know that they have options and various different places, uses, so countries or means of use for what they're growing, and that their products are valued. And so keeping or using more canola here at home makes sense for many reasons, right? But it certainly is an area where we have an opportunity to influence and help, support Canada in its objectives around environmental benefits from this industry. But it's absolutely pivotal for farmers and creating new market opportunities. So it's a pretty simple message.
Right. And Bruce, rather than kind of getting you to kind of answer that question from your with your grain growers hat on, I'm actually kind of curious as to how you answer this question, going back to some of the jobs that you've had in the
Yep.
past where you've worked for transportation sectors. It's not always been a kind of a clear cut kind of story there. How do you
Well,
think about that?
well, it hasn't. I mean, there is a connect. You're quite right, Tyler. There is a connection between how my farmers view this and how the marine carriers, for example, looked at this, and certainly farmers who are all about sustainable practices, very much like the greenhouse gas emission reduction story, and in the same vein, the marine carriers looked at this opportunity. In fact, they were ahead of the Canadian government in recognizing the value of using biodiesel in their marine engines. They've started experimenting with 8 ships in the Great Lakes 2 years ago using B20, for example, and they found that it was an 80 to 90% reduction in GHGs. And this was before the Canadian government really sort of recognized it, because they wanted 100% or nothing type of thing. And that's just wasn't practical. 80 to 90% is pretty darn good, particularly at the beginning of a major transition to a new fuel world down the road. So, I think the government is kind of getting more practical in that perspective now. But, having said that, there are still lots of challenges out there. There's still a big challenge on the price uptick compared to traditional, what's called marine diesel oil being used. And of course, the supply, as we were talking about today, demand. Not a lot of confidence that the supply will be out there if they were to move all of their ships, or if the railway companies were to move all of their locomotives, or farmers, for that example. I mean, there's some similarities in terms of farmers and other transportation providers. Farmers have operate a network of vehicles, be it tractors or other farm implements, harvesters that consume probably 1.5 2 billion liters of fuel a year. Well, the marine sector is about 2 billion a year. The railway sector is probably a bit bigger. So all three sectors are transportation network providers hungry, for new fuels. And obviously the farmers are experimenting with biomass diesel, and they have a number of fleets and F-150s and other vehicles that use gasoline, and that too is an additional demand. So lots of interest from that perspective, but sort of a pause in enthusiasm or confidence about just where the market's going, I would say.
Right. And so much of the challenge around where the market is going in this case is that it is the government that is in part deciding,
Yep.
largely deciding
Yep.
where the government's going. I mean, Bruce just talked about kind of the challenges around supply. Kind of a big part of the solution of addressing that is around investment. Andrew, maybe we'll go to you on this. And again, and you wrote recently about how what we're going through now reminds you of what we went through in 2016. Can you kind of dive into that and what that should be telling us about this investment space? And going back to some questions that we're getting in the chat, how do we get government to go faster so that we're taking advantage of this opportunity that's here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I take great comfort, and it's also, devastating that everything kind of reminds you of 4 years ago, 10 years ago. But there's a lot of familiarity, and there's a lot of, kind of lessons that I think like so. I kind of reflected on it, the comparison of, 2016 when we first started to make this shift from the previous federal renewable fuel standard that was volume based, much like the RVO in the US, to kind of the CFR, which introduced carbon intensity and the carbon market around it. And the comparison isn't political; it really is structural, right? So the crossroads there is that farmers, producers, in transitioning from the federal fuel standard into the CFR, it was kind of a little bit of a trust fall, right? Like you had to kind of deal with some ambiguity. You had to kind of get kind of big picture in terms of a shared objective and how to kind of align everyone towards a mutually beneficial goal. And policy building renewable fuel markets isn't new, and it isn't something that should be balked at. It's just the reality of how it goes. And there's a lot of policy determined markets. Biofuels isn't alone there. But I think that, what we can do now at this particular inflection point is I think we could benefit from a little bit of a reframe because the fundamentals haven't changed about demand. The benefit that should be going to the local grower and the local producer and all of the jobs that are there isn't new. We need bankable policy that unlocks and expedites investment. That's not new. But I think we need a reframe to go faster, right? Like we talk about, and again, kind of the specificity around ethanol. Yeah, when you look at generalities and when you look at kind of what's happening on the biomass-based diesel side, there are cost concerns. There are availability concerns. Those should be looked at in more detail. Those are not present on the ethanol side right now. How we talk about, the import situation fulfilling Canadian ethanol demand is like we're dependent on imports. We can't get there. Well, not without a policy fix, right? Like we should be talking about ourselves as the number one customer for ethanol imports, right? And we should kind of look at that as if we were in any other market, especially with like an energy security and independence and, kind of making the border work better for everyone involved, we would be looking at ourselves as customers and how to optimize so that we have like more secure local supply chains and then how we can optimize the border for things that actually need to move. And that's not what we're doing right now, right? So I think we need to reframe a little bit. I think we need to remind ourselves that we have common objectives here. I think we have to get big picture. Like if oil and gas can agree with biofuels on an ethanol multiplier, I think we can work together to get the government to go faster on canola and corn. I just believe that in the center of my being when I think about the CFR. And then I think, when we look at kind of what we're up against here a little bit as the broader industry, trade is a symptom for ethanol, but it's not the root cause, right? Like this is an issue that is correctable domestically. The CFR is our domestic policy. If we want to go faster and free up resources for the things that need a little bit more time and attention, then we should be looking at what we can fix right away, triage that before 2027, free up the resources and free up the expertise to dig deeper into the issues that need to be figured out. And that would kind of be my way of going about it.
But Andrea, I mean, we often hear, right, that the new federal government is going to act differently, move at kind of the speed of business. They're kind of changing the way business is done. But like, how optimistic are you the government can actually kind of wrap their heads around that? Do you see any signs the government's thinking about responding the way that you've outlined that?
I think we have to be really specific about what business they are modeling themselves after, right? Like, are they on a quarter to quarter publicly traded business cycle right now? No, they're not. But like, do they have the capacity to do that? I think so, right? Like, we're looking at these amendments like they came out of the blue. They didn't, right? Like these are two very specific questions that were asked. Industry was asking government for a 45Z acknowledgement and response for 4 budget cycles, right? It was pretty targeted in its scope. We've been consulting on it for 250 days, and we already have consensus on 50% of the questions that were asked, right? We can be going faster. I think any business could be going faster with those facts on the table. So I never give up hope, but we really have to keep working together to get there because this stuff just doesn't happen on its own.
Hey, Tyler, if I could chime in just on this conversation,
Mhm.
I think no apology should be made in terms of the government not moving fast enough on this. I wholeheartedly agree. I think the problem, and this is a problem everywhere on biofuels, is that they are inherently linked by policy and regulation. And biofuel policy or any policy or regulation does not move quickly. There's a process, there's consultation. So you're never going to see, in my opinion, nimble markets as it relates to how these things evolve. What government might want to consider is taking as much of the regulation and putting it outside the regulation for changes and modifications. And I'm going to get into some of the real granularity here, but the concept of credit multiplier has been mentioned several times, right? Free credits for biofuel producers in Canada to keep them whole. I think that's a good principle, but what if there's too many credits that come into the market and suddenly the entire market collapses? How does the government respond to that? Through another regulatory process that takes 3 years while everybody's looking at $5 for a credit? That doesn't work either, right? So maybe there's options within these policy and regulations where the market can be tweaked outside regulation, where a government can, for example, react within 30 or 60 days to make the market more balanced and ensure that there is predictability and consistency on something as important as credit prices.
I think this is where the facts set us free a little bit as well too, Chris, right? Because, consensus around a credit multiplier for ethanol is what we're talking about here. We are not in a scenario where we are going to be short ethanol. The US will never stop making it. It really is just about ensuring that a Canadian ethanol producer who buys Canadian corn can sell that ethanol in Canada with some sort of investment certainty from the policy that's Canadian before 2027. But I totally agree on that other step. And I think that's why, like, we've benefited for so long on kind of like big tent, right? Where you talk about biofuels and it's pretty synonymous. It doesn't really work that way anywhere else. Like when you look at the US, right? Like they tend to, have a little bit more specificity in terms of what they're targeting and what they're doing. There's good and there's bad that comes along with that. But I think, yeah, to avoid the scenario that you're talking about right now, we have to be specific in what we're asking for a multiplier in. But holding up other things for 3 years, like there's always a difference between a 30-day consultation and a 3-year consultation.
Well, and on that point, if I may, just to break in, Andrea, that's a very good point. And one of our jobs here at Grain Growers of Canada is to keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening in Ottawa. And there's clearly some fairly consistent signaling going on around town beneath the political layer, which suggests that the new government is going to be less tolerant of long consultation periods, less tolerant of stages and stages and stages of negotiations to end up with a new trade deal with another country, just to give a couple examples. And so there are some positive signals that we'll see more speed, but I think we haven't seen the results yet.
And again, I think that there's this need to balance, right, kind of the challenge of predictability with adaptability, and how do you get government to provide that long-term certainty that was alluded to earlier, but
Yeah.
also be adaptable. And Chris, I want to come back to you, and we're going to bring Sean in and talk about trade in a minute, but also want to talk about kind of the simplicity versus the nuance that's there, and kind of pick on carbon intensity as a piece of that puzzle, Chris, and kind of how do you think through this balance of trying to find kind of a simple solution that works for something like carbon intensity, but then that also incorporates all of the nuance and the differences and the flexibility are there. And are we finding that kind of right balance at the end of the day?
Yeah, I mean, carbon intensity, how much time do we have to talk about something that is fundamentally important to how the credits get determined and how these markets function? Is it simple today? I would say no. Is it simple anywhere? I would probably say no to that as well. Carbon intensity is extremely complex with regards to what goes into the estimates and all the different assumptions and whatnot. I think well, I don't think I know that the way that carbon intensity is estimated under the CFR continues to evolve. So we have a LCA model that is used for estimating carbon intensity scores under the clean fuel regulation. It's also far from perfect, but it does continue to evolve as it relates to the data that they use, the methodologies that they incorporate to get to better scoring, shall I say, as it relates to accuracy and also ultimately looking to get carbon intensity scores lower. There's lots of work that goes behind the scenes to making sure that particular model is updated in a way that satisfies all stakeholders. But I wouldn't say that there's a one size fits all approach to it. I know that there's discussion sometimes about, well, shouldn't we just have one model that works for markets, whether it's in Canada or the United States? On its surface, that sounds great. But all this technical stuff, this mumbo jumbo, I guess, as I referred to earlier, and I didn't mean to just refer to it as mumbo jumbo. It's important technical stuff, but it's also extremely political because there's dollars on the table. Again, carbon intensity equals credits, credits equals money. And because it's based on money and competitiveness, there's a lot of politics involved in terms of how the carbon intensities are determined.
And so we could spend a lot of time on this, and I want to pivot. And Sean, I'm going to give you the chance to ask the next question, but I'll ask a question first to Brittany because, Brittany, Chris talked about politics. There's probably kind of no greater politics in the space than on the cross-border side. And what does that look like, and how does that play out? Kind of where do you see kind of all of these issues fitting into Canada's trade agenda in the United States? Kind of how are you guys approaching the U.S. dynamic, and how do we find that right balance between protecting the Canadian industry without kind of adding another grievance to the U.S. trade agenda?
Yeah. I guess I'll maybe go at this from two angles, but we have, canola goes into the United States. It's our number one market for canola oil. Canadian canola producers are, very happy with the direction that the biofuel industry in the United States is going around the RVOs. Hopeful that, the renewable identification numbers, or the RIN challenges don't come to fruition, right? We want to ensure that that Canadian canola still has that marketplace in the United States, very critical market for us. And so we definitely see our markets on the renewable fuel side as being integrated, right? We've talked about imports, and so we understand that our industry will have domestic production and will have imports, and that canola oil will also feed into the United States market for both food, feed, and fuel. So we talk about, feedstock provisions within the targeted amendments, and we speak to them about being North American. And Chris already talked about this, that North American ring fence. And so that puts us into a position that's similar to some of that language and eligibility under 45Z Clean Fuel Production Tax Credit. It's also the language that we have in our Canadian biofuel production incentive, where North American feedstocks are preferred and used. We haven't talked about foreign used cooking oil, so I'll bring it up just here quickly. Of course, that's a topic that the canola industry has been vocal about. And so we do have concerns about foreign offshore used cooking oil and potential fraud related to it. And we want to ensure that Canadian canola, North American feedstocks are competing fairly, right? And so we have definitely spoken to government about this concern several times over a period of time, and we do really want to see that there are strong safeguards put in place to ensure that potentially fraudulent used cooking oil doesn't make it into the CFR, and that we're not competing against it that way. So I'd say that the United States, Europe have all put in their means of ensuring that those products are considered, and so we want to see Canada do the same. And we think that Yeah, that's also part of how we look at CUSMA, Canada, U.S., Mexico agreement, and ensuring that that we speak about and use that sort of language when we're talking about the CFR targeted amendments.
John, do you want to pick it up?
Yeah, sure. I'm interested, Chris, to pick up on that. One of the things that I've been talking about is that the Canadian canola crop gives the U.S. canola crop scale in this discussion as it tries to compete as a feedstock against, the mammoth acres of, 90 million acre plus of soybeans. As we've seen the domestic crush increase in Canada, could we see a possibility under this idea of the North American market or the North American ring fence, as you spoke about, where we could, as we see the growth of things like camelina and the growth of hybrid brassica gensea, where we're importing feedstocks and doing the crushing in Canada and then shipping the oil back to the US?
I think that's a possibility. We we import canola today to
Yeah.
crush and sell into different marketplaces, but at greater scale, I think there's absolutely an opportunity. There are some very interesting things going on in the United States as it relates to trying to increase canola production. So many different varieties being explored, lots in terms of varieties that are targeted towards winter canola. There's crush plants that are being built or modified in the United States to accommodate for some of that as well. But I think the point that you made in terms of the possibility of imports from the US coming into Canada and then the oil going back to the United States, I mean, that kind of crisscrossing of the border is so important for us not to lose sight of, right? As it relates to the relationship with the United States, there is always, in my opinion, going to be that crisscross of products.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrea, I just want to ask you a question about trade. We saw, and to put some numbers around it, sorry if I missed if you already put these numbers out, but Canada imported 792 million gallons of ethanol in 25, on pace based on Q1 numbers to likely surpass that here in 26. If you look at some of the trade deals that President Trump's been negotiating, energy is a key cog of that. We've got airplanes, we got autos, and we've got energy. And so Canada's going to be kind of careful here or sensitive to the fact that how they position CFR amendments that protect the Canadian industry or allow for a Canadian ethanol industry to exist, while also saying, we may import this ethanol, or do you see no matter what we do with the amendments that ethanol import number continuing to rise?
Yeah, I mean, continue like the privilege of continuing to exist, your words, not
Right.
not mine, but I don't disagree with it. This is what I think is reality with like a sprinkling of what gives me hope over the situation, right? So we have not heard ethanol enter the trade negotiation or even be brought up in the crosshairs yet. And I think that that continues to be to the benefit of both Canada and the US, right? The US isn't going to list it as an aggravant. Why would they, right? Again, number one customer. We're great to them. The CFR is a premium market. And they are breaking their own records at this point. All of this is hiding in plain sight, right? But they've surpassed their own, kind of limitation of 200 gallons a month in ethanol exports, and now they're just they're breaking their own records, and the majority of it's coming here, right? So the U.S. isn't going to raise it as an issue, and Canada hasn't either, and I think that's the right thing to do because this is a domestic issue. I've spoken to colleagues at RFA and Growth Energy, and they're wonderful in terms of highlighting Canada as a very, very solid market with a lot to offer and a lot of long-term mutual growth. And I think that that's genuine. I don't think they want to see the Canadian market completely displaced or disappear. Like, I don't think that that's part of a more solid kind of going back to what you're thinking about too, right? About like this North American ring fence and a sustainable relationship. I don't think that makes the CFR durable. I don't think that that makes a better trade relationship if Canadian ethanol becomes that disadvantaged. But, you know, I do think that when you look at the issue specifically of something like a Canadian ethanol credit multiplier versus an effort to get the US to abandon 45Z as a subsidy on export. I think we can all agree this is a much more trade compliant, much more beneficial, much lower drama path forward where everyone still gets to invest and make their market, decisions and make their, business investments as competitive as possible. I think that where we are facing the biggest divergence is that the US has gotten into the habit of treating its national biofuels policy for ethanol and biomass-based diesel as critical, as part of, like a pillar of its energy strategy, right? We aren't there yet. We're still talking about it like it's, it's technically niche or politically optional. I'll just add on really quickly because I don't think there's anything that kind of makes this point more about how commercial and growth oriented the US has been able to bring its biofuels policy, which has carbon intensity in it. That isn't like some weird climate thing. It's the anchor of the CFR, right? It's the anchor of the 45Z subsidy. They both run on carbon intensity models. Ours is nestled in with our environmental regulator at ECCC. The US made the conscious decision to have it administered by the IRS. That's all you need to know. That's all you need to know, right?
And your point there about continuing to grow it. I'm speaking at an event next week in Iowa, and a part of one of the things that was requested of me is talk about ways that we can continue to expand our biofuel policy in the U.S. Like this isn't a static thing. Tyler, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, sorry, Bruce, we'll come to you in a minute, but I want to touch on a question that we got because we're getting near the end of time, and I think it's an important piece of this that we haven't talked about yet. The question is around co-processing, right? So we're looking at taking those products and making them somebody else that can answer this, maybe give a better definition around kind of how it's different. But it's this opportunity to kind of increase production without in a less risky way, right? At the end of the day. Chris, maybe the question to you is what changes to the CFR will spur more investment in co-processing, and what does that mean for canola crushers in Canada?
Yeah, I think you did a good job describing CoPro, at least the Coles Notes version, Tyler. It's a big deal in terms of what the canola industry would view as growth opportunities in the short term. I'm going to go out on a limb and just make a guess. This is my own personal guess, but I don't foresee any new bricks and mortar renewable diesel or biodiesel plants being built in Canada because of some of the things that we talked about, right? The unlevel playing field and the market uncertainty and all that kind of stuff. But co-processing can be done at a refinery, at a traditional oil and gas refinery, with less expense, and it can be done quicker. But they still run renewable feedstock like canola oil, for example. So that particular opportunity is an important one. And we would say that co-processing should be in scope for these targeted amendments and for any biofuel supports that are being considered.
Yeah, appreciate that. Bruce, you wanted to make a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to go, thanks, Tyler. I wanted to go back and add an asterisk to that conversation between Andrea and Sean when we were talking about ethanol and the cross-border sort of market. And clearly, we see a great example of that integrated marketplace to Andrea's point, which is, the U.S. should remain agnostic almost to whether the fuel stock is coming from feedstock is coming from Canada or the U.S. But on ethanol, it's interesting. I think I saw a figure recently, 70% historically of ethanol in the East has been heavily subsidized U.S. Ethanol. And so the Ontario government is doing some interesting things to try and protect local ag supply chains and sort of shield our farmers, as it were, from some of those heavily subsidized imports. And they're getting more aggressive on the E mandates. Used to be an E10, now it's moving to E11 at the moment. It's going to grow, I think, the E15 beyond 2030. And so that's going to grow, Canadian-based corn demand. And, already we're growing, 2.5 million tons of corn. Those mandates, if they come to fruition, could be, I hear, an additional 1.5 million tons of corn. So that's a really interesting direction as an
For
example.
for the American farmer potentially as well too, right? Like it's kind of up for grabs right now, Bruce, exactly as you're saying. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a critical component of here that is missing in Canada in my opinion, and maybe Brittany wants to follow up on this, but is it was described earlier, whether it's apathy or just avoidance of the issue. The reality is one of the big differences if you want to compare the two markets, and Andrea knows this fully as well, is that the farmer at the ground level cares about this as a demand creation solution to diversify away from trade realities that exist today.
Right.
And that's the piece of the puzzle, Brittany, that is truly a gap here right now in Canada, comparatively speaking.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm glad you asked me about that. For sure, there's a real opportunity to do a lot of communication to growers to help them fill in the gaps in terms of the information that they need in order to, yeah, be like just gung ho about it, like our US friends are. And I think, we've done at CCGA, we've done some kind of informal asking out to growers, making sure we understand where they're at, because I think we've had this conversation many times about farmers not being on side with biofuels. And I've kind of challenged us. I'd like to challenge us anyway to say, is that actually true? I think what we've come back with, the information that we have, is that farmers very much aware and understand canola and biofuels being linked. They're very much aware and understand that there is market opportunity there. I think where the information has been missing, and what we have it now, is what is the actual benefit to me as a farmer? How is it impacting my farm gate price of canola? And so we have that now. So we have done some market analysis to understand what kind of value does the CFR specifically bring to the farm gate price of canola. And so what we know is that in the 25-26 crop year, which we're still in, that the CFR has brought nearly 600 million in value back to the price of canola. That's $27 a ton. That's 62 cents per bushel. And so we wanted to understand that, because we have heard U.S. farmers talk about the value in terms of an actual price, right? And so we have that now. We're sharing that information. Provincial canola associations are sharing that information. You'll see more of it come out from CCGA here very soon as well. So it'll be, it'll be my talking point here for a good while, just making sure that message is out and everyone knows it. And I would say, when I think about this, I think farmers really strongly connect their canola oil to heart healthy canola oil, right? Think about canola meal, selling it to dairy cows so they produce more milk. We need to add a third, right? We need canola farmers to be really proud to grow canola that is used to produce low carbon fuels here in Canada, in the United States, and Europe. So I think that's something that we're working towards. We're not quite there yet, but we're moving in the right direction.
And it's hard to think of kind of a single policy mechanism in ag in Canada that has a $600 million impact like that every year. Just really worth underscoring it. We're a little bit over time, but Andrea, I want to ask you one question that hopefully we'll get a quick answer to, and then we'll go one last roundtable around the group. Bruce talked about the provinces. Andrew, we're looking for an FPT report to come out in the very near future. Can you just tell us a little bit more around what that is and what you're hoping to see in the FPT task force report?
Yeah, absolutely. So we contributed to that process. We think that it's exceptionally well timed, especially with a focus on renewable fuels and biofuels that they've given it. I think getting leadership both at the federal and the provincial levels back in lockstep is important, not just when you look at kind of that used to kind of be part of the biofuels broader sectoral story in Canada pre-CFR, but also just looking at successful, kind of sectors who have been able to advance their own industries and their own opportunities as part of this trade negotiation, you need to have that provincial backup with you. So, certainly looking at ethanol, working with Ontario, as Bruce mentioned, that's a province that's already kind of stepped up, right? Saw the cannoli the canary in the mine, and kind of did something as an interim to 45Z. Quebec is another, kind of just wealth of production and growers for us. So hopefully that FPT comes out with a report that is very, very, kind of solid on biofuels, production and growth and investment oriented, helps us solidify the farm to fuel kind of ag to energy corridor, right? Because no department can kind of do that on their own. I think NRCan Natural Resources is well suited to do it, and also makes it public so we can all read all of their good work, right?
Great. Thank you. So let's go around the table one last time. I'll use a question from Cami that was in the chat to wrap things up with everyone. And Bruce, we'll go to you first on this. What's the single most important policy signal Canada needs to send right now to keep biofuel investment anchored here rather than shifting to the US? So we'll go to Bruce, then Brittany.
Well, I think we've kind of answered that in terms of continuing to, create that mechanism that is going to drive demand. And I think the U.S. sort of relationship right now is critical from a signal perspective. We're going to be down as part of a mission next week in Washington. We'll be arguing and supporting this concept of an integrated, North American marketplace. We argued something very similarly on the marine side a year ago and won. We went further to say this was a fortress North American approach, and the Americans bought into it. So, I think that's going to be an important signal in general.
Right.
That we'll see from cross-border negotiations and discussions which are about to kick off.
Okay, thanks. Bruce, Brittany, to you, one signal that governments can send?
I think it's integrating North American feedstock into these targeted amendments, ensuring that North American feedstock are required in order to have any of these additional supports like the credit multiplier or minimum domestic content, et cetera, that are put forward. So that's what we want to see, and that will drive real incremental growth for canola demand and biofuels in Canada.
Thanks. Chris, to you?
Make it nonpartisan. And if I can add one more, extend the ambition beyond 2030. Make it longer term.
Great. Thank you. And Andrea, to you, the final word.
CFR and trade are both going to be way less durable and way more difficult for all of us if they do not unlock investment and they do not create stability for farmers, right? So I would say, much like the biofuels incentive for renewable diesel and canola that came out in September, ethanol has not received a signal that Canada will invest in ethanol production yet. So whether it is part of the CFR amendment process, whether it is something announced as part of the FPT or beforehand, put in an ethanol specific credit multiplier now, tell corn farmers that they can exhale a little bit, and then we can all contribute more broadly and more constructively to things that are longer term like the CFR and to Canada-US trade negotiations for generations to come.
Great. Thank you, Andrea, Chris, Bruce, Brittany, and to Dave before. Sean, I will hand it over to you to wrap things up and to sign off.
Great stuff. Well, Tyler, I think this has been really awesome because I think this is a topic that does need more attention. And it's not just attention, but there's things to be done, right? We've got to move. We saw it in the chat. We got to move faster. We have, especially from an ethanol perspective, we have CFR amendments that are being suggested and pushed by not only the fuels industry, but also agriculture and everyone in between to as a defense mechanism against our entire industry really being challenged from a survivability standpoint. As we want to avoid the outcome that the UK has experienced. And on the renewable diesel side, it's a tremendous opportunity. And the delegation that's going down to DC next week, I really hope, Tyler, that they are talking about how Canadian feedstock, specifically canola, lead to not only fuel security, but also affordability for American taxpayers, as affordability is just as big of a concern in the US as it is in Canada. So this is really a if you were to go back 10 years, there's kind of a policy that was sort of talked about in some corners of some meetings, but does not necessarily have the full frontal focus that it does now. So I appreciate all of our guests joining us here today. It's been awesome. I learned a lot. It was great.
Yeah, great. And again, this is what we're here for, Sean, is to shine some of that light. So appreciate the partnership with Real Ag on this. And we also want to acknowledge and appreciate the support from BASF and their ongoing support and leadership in this too. Stay tuned to Cappy and Real Agriculture for what comes next. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.